Good afternoon, welcome. My name's Dave Boundy, and what I want to talk about this afternoon, I've entitled Megagame Makers, but as you'll see, that's a title that itself needs a bit of defining. And I've been asked to talk about the history of megagames, and really that's what this has turned out to be. So let me say who I am first. I regard myself as a total newcomer in that some of the people around have been around since 1980, and I played my first megagame in 1991. I've been to 108 megagames, almost all of which were Megagame Makers megagames. I don't have a wargamer background. I don't have a history background. I come from a role-play background. My early board game and role-play career, if you like, was in diplomacy and what was known then as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I have 3 megagame designs to my name. Washington Conference, and that's totally to my totally in my name. I then was part of the team for a game about the Somme called Price of Victory, and we'll go over some of these a bit later, so you'll get a good idea, I think. But Price of Victory was very much a cooperative effort, certainly between Jim Wallman and myself, and Bernie Ganley was involved, Muckle Patel was involved, Andy Granger was involved. Very much a Megagame Makers type of approach. Is everybody okay? Right, my final one, which I did with Brian Cameron, is Interesting Times. And Interesting Times is about Chinese warlord era, and we had a great time doing that. Right, people are joining me today are going to be involved throughout this. Jim Wallman and Chrissy Sliney-Biss probably need very little introduction to many of you, but they, along with Brian Cameron and I, have been the admin officers for Megagame Makers, which is to say a sort of first amongst equals. So, Jim, would you just like to introduce yourself to any new comers that might not know you?
Yes, okay. I'm Jim Wallman. I've designed a few megagames over the last 30 years or so. Megagames, I feel like a Simpsons character. You may remember me from such megagames as Watch the Skies or Urban Nightmare. So I can't remember how many megagames I've designed. It's probably about 70 now. I've taken part and run quite a few. So that's, and I was a founder member of Megagame Makers. That's me.
Thank you, Jim. Chrissy.
Hello. So I saw the Shut Up, Sit Down, Watch the Skies video and then joined this lot. I played a lot. And my first megagame, 7, was unfortunately delayed due to Corona, but and yeah, I'm the new admin officer, but I haven't had yet again because of Corona. But yeah.
Thank you. Right. So, Megagame Makers, where have we come from and what have we done? Well, Megagames started in about 1980. I'll come on to exactly when. And after about 10 years, Megagame Makers was formed. So Megagame Makers has been going for 30 years, 1990. In that time, there have been 175 games, and I counted each and every one of the attendances, and there were 10,300 of them. That's to say, on our database, we have 3,600 people. I also looked at how active those people were, and during the last 2 years, that's to say 2018, 2019, there have been 488 people that have attended a Megagame of Megagame Makers. So active and at the forefront of the hobby, very much the home of Megagames. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to separate out my thoughts, and can I make the point that these are very much my personal thoughts here. The other two will jump in if they are really jumping up and down at home, feeling very cross with me. But these are very much my personal thoughts. So I want to look at, firstly, the dawn of time, that's to say the period before Megagame Makers. Then the period after that until 2014, and it is still going on, is really, I think of it as a period of continuing change driven by Megagame Makers, by all of the designers and the admin people involved in Megagame Makers. Everything that we can change for the better, we do. I want to go over some of the culture, some of the values, some of the ways we operate as Megagame Makers, and then aliens hit the fan in 2014, and I want to look at some of the fallout of that and what we have done and will be doing. If you've got any questions, we'll try to deal with those either in the text channel or during the talk, and we'll pause after every one of those blocks to allow questions to be asked through Jim and Chrissy. And if we still don't get round to them, I undertake to answer any questions that are left in that text channel after this. I had originally hoped to have a number of video clips that were really brought out some of the points that I'll be making. So I interviewed Terry, Bernie, Andy and Neil, whose names you might not know, but I'll introduce you to them as we go. And those people were very involved in some of the early stuff with Megagame and Megagame Makers. And I've taken clips from my interviews, and I have not really wished to put those into this presentation because I couldn't do it and guarantee that you'd all get to see them and hear them properly. So what I've done is I've put those in a YouTube channel, and I'll give you the link at the end, so you get a freebie after this. You get half an hour's look at a video channel and see what some of the people have said about the topics that I'll be covering. Okay, let's start then with the dawn of time. The four people that I've put there, Terry Martin, Jim Wallman, Andy Granger and Brian Cameron, that was the group that formed Megagame Makers. The first person to really get into the whole idea of Megagames was a certain lecturer at Sandhurst and at the Army's War College, Staff War College at Camberley, and that was Paddy Griffith. He was an ideas person. He had these grand ideas, and he brought together thoughts on wargaming, on history. He was a and on his idea of how everything really should impinge on wargames. So at one stage, he organised a meeting which became the Conference of Wargamers. At the same time, in 1975, or from that, an equally fascinating story to be told about a group called Chestnut Lodge Wargames Group. And this group met in a house which was called Chestnut Lodge. It had a huge, great chestnut tree in the garden. And that group really was part of the same network that was starting to evolve. the final bit that I think for me seems quite important was an adult education class that was run by Brian Cameron in the Ernest Bevin School. And a number of the war games people that we now would recognise every time we come to war games, to Megagames, got involved in that, and that was really part of the same networking and part of the same group, which ended up as a melting pot for Megagames. So let's have a look at that. Actually, funny enough, the Ernest Bevin College is in some regards, some regard it as a pretty rough school. In fact, our current mayor, Sadiq Khan, went there, and that's what he said about it. It's a tough school. It wasn't always a bed of roses. It was in an area of South London that people might think of as rough, or you might think of as edgy if you're of that inclination. And this was the place where the War Games class run by Brian took place. There's a brilliant clip of Neil Parker talking about his experience there, but what's very clear is that they started from the idea of war games as they had been, and the idea that those war games were not good enough, and that there needed to be huge change. They weren't war gamers, and this is, I think, a misconception. Megagames were not from war games as such. They developed from war games by saying, we don't think that war games do it anywhere near well enough. You can hardly overstate the role of Chestnut Lodge in this whole bringing together of a group of people and development of an approach. Chestnut Lodge War Games Group to this day is dedicated to improving game design through quality. And that is meant, that's not just some statement. Every member of Chestnut Lodge is meant to actually bring a development session or a finished game that they've designed to a meeting once a year. They're meant to sit down and say, and not meant to, they do sit down and enjoy the criticism that comes from those, because that's the way that they improve. So when I went there, which I think was in 1992 or 3, it was a breath of fresh air. It was a let's break the mold here approach, and it was very freewheeling, very much of the time. The Conference of Wargamers started as a conference in Moore Park run by Paddy Griffith. It was new approaches in war games, and it built on his idea that war games were a serious way of educating people, of understanding what had gone before, understanding the place of the different levers in making decisions. And it still meets annually, and it has a really quite large following of people. It's somewhat more stylized now rather than freewheeling, maybe, but that's possibly a personal view. The first the first mega game. This was Paddy Griffith's game called Memphis Mangler. It was set in Vietnam, and it was set at different levels. So it involved Vietnamese policemen, it involved Vietnamese head chieftain, head people of the village. It involved napalm. It involved large battalion. It was very big. It was very different, and it was a deliberate attempt to break away from war games as would have been known. Jim, what's your feeling about Memphis Mangler from your recollection?
Well, it was like a number of the other things we were experimenting with at the time. It was an attempt to introduce a degree of command and control, a degree of particularly in the context of Vietnam, seeing a perspective of the Vietnamese people and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong that was often not seen at the time. At the time, war games tended to be very much equipment based, very much military technology based, and the sort what would now be seen as perhaps the more interpersonal soft elements, the political, the social, were less in evidence. And Paddy tried to merge all of those into one experience, which was dynamic, chaotic, and was in many ways quite an important experience for a lot of people. It involved a mixture of civilians and military personnel. It involved lots and lots of toy soldiers and maps and radios and so on. So it was quite a heavily improvised, heavily dependent on the facilitation of it. But for many of us, it was quite a departure.
Thanks. Right, I'm going to pause there for questions if there are any. I don't know.
Yeah, we've got one question from Peter, Minnesota, who said that could you articulate some of the original criticisms of classical war games made by Chestnut Lodge? I mean, maybe I can make a stab at that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, when Chestnut Lodge was formed, a number of us were young, enthusiastic, and highly critical of everything, especially everything that had gone before. And of course, when you're in your 20s, you are pretty certain you know the right answer for everything. And I don't think any of us were any exception at that point. However, what we criticised was the somewhat stylized nature of wargaming at the time. That has changed, but at the time, wargaming was very much characterised by lining up toy soldiers, by intricate and long-winded game mechanisms, with no element of command and control and no element of understanding how hierarchies worked or any of the kind of other factors like logistics or interface with civilians. So we felt that there could be more could be done. Paddy Griffith was extremely influential in some of the attitudes that went on at the time, and so Wargame Developments and Chestnut Lodge both were trying to extend our repertoire in wargaming, so that was kind of where that went, really.
I think from my perspective, oh, sorry, Jim, go on.
No, carry on.
I think I don't, from my perspective, I wasn't a war gamer, but I'd always seen war games as exactly how Jim articulated there. And when I joined, what really struck me was how things were very different by reference to reality. So if there was an uncertainty about something, they would say, well, what would happen in reality? And it very much struck me that war games as they were then were not real. They were a game, which was quite entertaining. In fact, I've come to play some of them now, and they're quite entertaining, but they didn't have that depth that linking it to reality gives. So the classic example is the fog of war that you don't get from the overview of a map, and that led to hidden movement.
Yeah. So I've got two more questions stacked up. Alex Beck of Horizon Megagames asks, which of the various groups and influences was most important, do you think? And what were the key developments made?
Okay, I'd like to go over some of the developments later. And if I don't answer the questions, then by all means come back, Alex. As far as the key, I'm not quite sure what you're meaning by the key groups. I identified the two key groups, and I think also very important was that War Games group. I don't know if there were others around that you might add, Jim.
No, I mean, I would say that the Paddy was a big influence. Wargame Developments was a big influence at the time, and I mean, what were the key developments made? That's a big question, and I think probably we'll talk a bit more about that. Dave will talk a bit more about that in the presentation to come. Next question is from somebody called Jerry Elsmore, the UK, who asks how important was Simon Shakewell's input in the early days.
Right.
I think I can answer that and say it was his inputs were seminal. And
was not in on the joke. Simon Shakewell was a character that was adopted as somebody that could do very strange things and not be identified, and is the cause of a long-standing joke. But I think we'll just leave that and go on.
Bit of an in-joke. Okay, that's all I've got at this point for questions. Obviously, just remind people that the OMG Con panel questions channel is where we will deal with the questions as they crop up. So I'm keeping an eye on that, and we'll feed in your questions as and when we can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jerry. Right, let's have a look at the launch of Megagame Makers. Well, the Memphis Mangler was 1980, and there were a lot of successful and a few non-successful mega games in the period up to 1990. But what was becoming very clear was that some amount of organisation was needed. Paddy, I'm told, was not really somebody that necessarily thought that the amount of organisation required was something he thought he should be involved in. And so there was a launch of Megagame Makers with those 4 people who started it. And the first game was Springtime for Hitler. Springtime for Hitler was the game about Germany attacking in 1940, and it led to the fall of France. This game managed to recruit 167 players, and when we talk about players, generally in the past we've been unable to distinguish that much between players and control. So that would be 167 players in control, and that was much too big for one person, and it was very much a team effort. Jim managed to sell the idea to Brian by pointing out the amount of politics involved, and they all knuckled down and actually worked on the game, both from the point of view of the development and the production. It was really the first game where all of the elements came together. Maybe some of the elements had been there quite importantly before. Maybe there had been politics before. It's a little unsure exactly when that was. There's certainly been a lot of communications development before with a game called Battle of Britain, which was used extensively in this game as well. It was a game with press, and all of the elements that you would now recognise as a mega game, all working together. Jim, how about your thoughts from Springtime for Hitler? Could try just to get beyond the gasp, oh God, what did I do?
Yeah, well, Springtime for Hitler was wasn't the first large game that we'd done. And hang on just a minute, I'm getting a lot of feedback on my mic. Has anybody else got that?
Okay. You're okay.
Okay, so it wasn't the first one that we'd done that was large game. So the size wasn't actually that big an issue. We'd done a similar sized games around Battle of Britain and science fiction game. But it was, what was significant about it was the way in which it was a design team that created it, and so there was probably about 10 of us, or one way or another. Certainly a core of about 6, and a few others that did elements. And that was that process was really a tremendous creative process. So it was held together. I guess you know, I had a sense of what the overall picture was going to be like, but I didn't have to do everything, and different parts of the game were developed by different people. Different parts of the briefing were written by different people. So there was a real joy in it being a collaborative effort, and I would commend the method to anybody developing a new game, to where you can bring in that enthusiasm and commitment. The only thing that I found that I don't think we ever really replicated it on this scale subsequently in terms of numbers of people involved. But it was certainly I think, and we were lucky that the dynamic of the group was very positive. It was a very constructive group. We were all friends. We all got on well, and there didn't seem to be any kind of power struggle or ego stuff, which can get in the way of group working. And so that was probably my most formative memory of springtime. And it also had tremendous challenges in terms of what we tried to do. We tried to have a communication system involving intercoms, and we spent a lot of time running wires all around the venue, connecting up tables with little plastic intercoms, and inevitably that failed at various levels. And as I say, no plan survives first contact with the players. The players were challenging in other ways. So. But it was one of those things where we didn't know we couldn't do it, so we just did it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that keeps coming through, how the whole drive of Megagame Makers has been innovation, and just, we can do it. Really? Yes, we can do it. But I think we were there before Obama even. Okay, let's have a look at some of what I want to do is just try to track through some of the areas which have changed and where we think we've made improvements, and just take some interest as well. We very much devotees of the keep it simple, stupid school of thought. You get the game model, and you have to model things. You can't reproduce every single little bit of reality. That's not, it's just not feasible and not fun. And what we've realized is that you can apply fewer and fewer levers so that you can have a set of rules which are simpler and simpler, but have the same overall effect on the game. When I was a long time ago, I was in a job where I was doing a lot of forecasting, and it always struck me as really quite a thought that the best forecast from the weather people was a forecast that said tomorrow will be the same as today. And under some circumstances, that's precisely what you need, an absolutely simple approach, but you have to make it appropriate. What I was also been struck by is the amount of insight you get when you're writing the mechanisms, in particular, when you're researching a game, when you're writing a game. I've been particularly struck by the mechanisms that were developed by Jim and Brian for Master of Europe, which is a Napoleonic grand strategy, grand political, grand tactical game. And they looked at originally looked at the books, looked at the standard stuff that you would do, and came up with a set of combat mechanisms. Then they looked at what had actually happened, and they thought, this doesn't feel right to us. And then they did some research on beyond that, and they came up with a novel approach, which actually works incredibly well, feels great, and actually I think is more realistic than the history would have had them do. When Brian and I did Interesting Times, we had to come up with mechanisms for China in the 1920s, which is difficult because you get very few books on it. The books you get are contradictory. They often contradict themselves within themselves. It's a bit better now, but it's still not good. And we came to realize the same thing, that what we were reading about just didn't hold water. And we had to do a lot of research. I was to be seen poring over manuscripts in the London School of Economics library for about 18 months before, to try to understand what was going on there. And it has to be appropriate, and it's always innovative, because even if you run a game a second time, there are always improvements that can be made, so you make them. That's part of the quality criticism development culture. And I was very struck by a Cthulhu mega game that had a number of innovative mechanisms, and this one really struck me. They took sanity as being marbles, so that if you lost your marbles, I'm not sure if you have that in the US, but over in this country, if you've lost all your marbles, you've gone insane. And so insanity, of course, doesn't prevent you playing the game. It might be required, in fact, in some games, but it will give you an altered view of the world. So they let them loose on an entirely new set of personal briefings. So they were playing a different game almost within the game. We have become more and more involved. So to me, politics and diplomacy is of itself interesting and fun. There is obviously politics in each game. As you have a hierarchy, as you have interpersonal relationships, even if you don't design it in, you will have the politics of internal relationships. Office politics have nothing on mega games. But taking it a step further was something that Brian Cameron did in Congress of Vienna, which was rerun later as the Dancing Congress. To me, this was a revelation. It was groundbreaking because it had no or very, very few mechanisms as such, no operations, and it had an imposed turn structure. It had an imposed, a given set of roles, which were very clear, but it was totally about politics. So I followed that up and developed the idea from that and devised Washington Conference. Anybody that wants it can have the whole thing free. And I would make the point that very often you'll find most mega game makers, unless they're selling stuff, like, and even Jim makes some free, but most mega game makers are very approachable and will produce whatever they can to help you. And this actually, it ended up with the highest enjoyment score of any London mega game. There was a higher Mega Game Makers enjoyment score of a Leeds game about Martians that Jim did, but this is the highest enjoyment score for a London mega game. And that confounds people. When they come to Washington Conference, they look at it and they say, well, that's a pretty dull thing. You want to talk about 1921 naval disarmament? I want to go out and sink a few battleships, or I want to go out and clobber a few people. But then they come along and they find that they get involved in the game and that actually politics is of itself interesting and fun. I was very taken with A Very British Coup, which was about Labour Party politics in the 90s. And this was a really interesting era, the Labour Party trying to get things done. And it led to a book which led to the mega game. Now that's called something else, and Jim has taken it on from there. But when I played it, it was called A Very British Coup, and it is totally about politics, although taking a very different approach with actually quite a lot of mechanisms involved. I think there's much more to investigate and develop here, and I'd invite anybody to think about that and have a look at it and have a go. Right, hidden movement. Sorry, Jim. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say we picked up a couple of questions which I was thinking we might be worth doing before we move on too much further, because they relate to something you were saying. Is that okay?
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, okay. So just because I kind of sense you going into the next bit, the question from Peter in Minnesota, could you elaborate on the specific Master of Europe innovations by Jim and Brian?
As I understand it, jump in here, but as I understand it, the way that things happened after a battle was poorly understood, but the data was there to look at withdrawal rates, where they withdrew to, the way that they reformed around rivers, etc. And that really hadn't been something they'd been able to take into account properly before looking at the data as opposed to the opinions. Now, that's my reading of it, Jim, from what I've talked to.
That's pretty close. I mean, obviously there's a lengthier description, but the key things, we were looking at battle from very much a macro level, because this was for a mega game, and we wanted to play several battles in the course of a mega game. So we were started looking at how battles were lost, not how they were won, and what happened when you were defeated, which is not a perspective we'd taken before. And also challenging a few of the givens. A lot of people talk about combat odds and outnumbering 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, and we discovered that wasn't really how it worked, which is probably not a surprise to many people, but it was enough of a starting point for a whole load of innovations. But thank you for that question. I mean, there's a lot more to say on that, but maybe we can do another time. Second question from Alex Beck at Horizon. Would Springtime for Hitler seem very familiar to modern players if it were to be run today, or would it feel different? Basically, how much have things changed since then?
Whoa. I wasn't at Springtime for Hitler, one of my great regrets. So my impression is that you would recognise the aspect of it, and you would recognise the overall feel of it, but that the actual presentation would be incredibly different, and that the simplicity would be less, and maybe and also it would be very much a hidden movement, etc., and you wouldn't necessarily recognise that. And the theme, of course, there are very few largely operational games, but with politics involved at the moment. How's that?
I mean, it's fine. I have run it since then. We renamed it Victory in the North. Was it Victory in the West? We've renamed it War in the West, I think it's now called. And didn't actually change very much of it when we did some reruns a few years ago. So I don't think it would feel deeply unfamiliar. As Dave says, there's not that much operational military stuff done these days. There is some, particularly I know that the Pennines group in the north of England are doing quite a lot. So it wouldn't be utterly unrecognisable. So some aspects have not changed, and so for example, sub games in Springtime would be things like national cabinet meetings. So there'd be national cabinet sitting and discussing top level strategy or diplomacy whilst the war is going on. Well, we've done that in lots of games. That's now a staple, even though it was something relatively new at the time.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
I mean, bathwater is not thrown out, or rather, the child is not thrown out when you throw the. There is a lot of continuity. Okay.
Okay, that was it.
Right. Well, in fact, that neatly moves on to this point, which is that actually, at the time, hidden movement was the thing. And what this resulted in was a role which was called the liaison umpire, LU. And the liaison umpire was the way that the players interacted with the map, and the way the players largely interacted with the game model, so that they would sit in their teams and the liaison umpire would come to them and then take their orders and go off to the map, where the liaison umpire would do a lot of the adjudication, helped by and whipped along by map control. Sometimes political control would get directly involved. Sometimes they would also go via the LU. But the LU was an absolute key role. And the LU was a role which represented all of the lower part of the hierarchy, because very often these games were hierarchy. And so the hierarchy finished at the players. So if you were playing Bradley and Montgomery on a D-Day, well, you didn't want to have to decide which way you turned when you came. That you might have a map of the roads and find it very useful and important, but there would be a lot going on underneath. And the liaison umpire's job was to be an umpire first and foremost, not a player. So he didn't belong to the team, he belonged to the umpires, and they were referred to as umpires then, or control as we would know them now. And this LU would represent the activity of everybody underneath. And anything that, therefore, that went wrong underneath, he might interject if he felt that the orders were not sufficiently clear, or if he felt that there were certain things going on that needed reacting to. And sometimes the liaison umpire would give the reaction of troops on the ground to what was happening on the battlefield. The other interesting point was the non-played control. Now, non-played control very much has been around in every political game, because if you want to make a political game real, you have to recognise that it's not a confined space you're operating in. You have to have somebody that is going to represent the other teams around, or the other countries, or whatever. And that can be quite a challenging role, but one that I love, and I know some others do, because what you're doing is making sure that you're not just a speed bump, and that the players don't go, oh well, that's not played, let's just go over there and take them over. But to do so, you have to keep very tight control of it. And I'm sure John in West Coast Megagames won't mind me pointing out that the approach that he had to casting in the Sengoku game gave me a bit of a headache, because I played in Sacramento a game called Sengoku, which I'll come on to a bit later. And he had allocated roles as teams as they wished to take them on as they arrived, so that there were a number of teams that were interspersed with the other teams. So non-played control in this country was one player. Non-played control in Sacramento was a team of three of us, and we were flying and exhausted by the end of it. Very enjoyable experience. Okay, so all of that was as it was. Now what we've got is very much concentrated on the players, and this partly was through difficulty with numbers, because as you contract, you don't want to be spending the number of experienced people that you've got on control. What you want to be doing is reducing the number of control if you can. And that led to this horrible phrase, umpire light megagames. But it led to the idea of team control, which has been refined from liaison umpire, but it is to do with looking after the team. The players will very often go to the map. There is open movement, so that's where they should be. And we've introduced the idea of player control as somebody who will be there to help. And that's very recent, because we've recognized that very often new people coming along need quite a bit of help. Non-played control, thank goodness, is still there. So if you like to actually be challenged intellectually during the day, then please do so. Please make sure that your megagames have non-played control and that you volunteer for them. There was a famous occasion I have in one of the Neil Parker video clips, where Neil had to argue with himself, and eventually he was representing two Balkan teams, I think, or two Balkan countries, and he had to argue with himself because the situation was developing where they were very much at odds with each other, and eventually he had to declare war on himself. Okay, the very noticeable thing is pen and paint to bitmap to vector, and at the same time from using spray paints in the early days to printing out on colour on panels and taping them together to the large-scale print that we have now, which I think is excellent quality. There are two schools of thought about this. One is that simple presentation enhances playability because you are just emphasizing the important parts of a game. And the other is that you can have the experience enhanced by presenting things attractively. Neither of those are correct, and I've stated them like that deliberately to put them opposed to each other, but they're not really. You have to match what you're doing to the audience that you have and to the game. But I have to confess that I tend to lean towards the interactive enhances experience. So let me give you a few examples of the presentation. Actually, this is a recent game, but Bernie Ganley's Red Dawn about the Russian Civil War was very much an old-style map. It was produced by spray paint and by printing out those railway lines and sticking them onto the map. It was done in a very old-fashioned, but I think it's a brilliant-looking map. And his previous ones to the Spanish Peninsula were also very attractive. They really got me into the idea that this should be an attractive game. I couldn't go on without mentioning Price of Victory. This was a game about the Somme campaign or Somme battle in 1916. The bloodiest day of the British Army on the first day of the Somme had 60,000 casualties. So it's very much in the British psyche, or should be very much in the British psyche. And so it's a place where school children are taken to visit the battlefield. What we did was to devise a mega game for 120 school children to take part and have some sixth formers who were set as the high command, so that there would be a certain amount of antagonism between them. Sorry, a sixth form is a high school student, and this was a map that had to allow for movement of 120 school children milling around it all day. So it had to be big, and it had to actually be able to be laid out. What you see there is the map laid out for them to operate on. There were thick MDF counters that wouldn't blow away in a wind, and the whole map measured 24 feet by 24 feet. It also had an innovation that I was quite pleased with. This was a game that, again, was very much a team development, but overall Jim led the rules and understanding and the initial idea, and I led the production and the mapping. So I mapped out movement areas, which you can see on the left. That was what we had on that board. So on the board, it was very simplified, down to the point where they would see what they needed to see to move their troops. And it allowed a certain amount of lateral movement while making it linear between in the final approach to the trenches. So, and that was developed from my understanding from what Jim, Bernie, Muckle and various others had taught me. But I also wanted an attractive map. So what you got on the right was what higher command had and divisional. And that meant that they didn't know exactly how their troops were to be moved. They just knew where they were to go. And that allowed them to take on the role properly. Finally, on the presentation bit, this is Bernie Ganley's Spanish, Spanish game. And he'd done a game of the Spanish Peninsula and needed a new map on this. He'd rather defined the scale by producing the counters first. So we had to produce the map. And I knew how attractive he'd made his maps, so I wanted to help him and go one better. I didn't manage it, but this is what we managed, and I think it looks quite attractive. So I've given you some detail of the whole map there, but the whole map had to be split in 5 to play it. Overall, everybody has a scale, an ambition to do things and an appreciation of scale, which really I am still flabbergasted at. When I was talking to Jim about this earlier, I pointed this slide out, and this is a slide about the Last War, which was a 2-day mega game about World War II in the period 1941 onwards, and it was to celebrate the 100th mega game. It absolutely involved every aspect that could be thought of industrial war and of that world war. It involved all of that, and I've missed off development of new weapons and eventually use of nuclear weapons or atomic weapons, and was a hell of a challenge. And when I put out that I'd said that this was really an example where we said, no, we can't do that, and had been able to do it, Jim was a little unsure still that he'd recovered enough to say that we can do it. And this was some while back. So this is where we played it. It was 100th game, so we celebrated. We went to HMS President 1918, which was moored on the north bank of the Thames, and you've got an idea of the way the map looked on the left and how it looked on the day with Australia, and everything was done to the same scale. It was printed out on A3 sheets and then taped together. It had to have all sorts of things developed as new things. So up on the top right, you'll see that almost at the end, there were the war crimes courts that were in session. And I think that's Bernie Ganley voting. I can guess which way he's voting there. It also had to deal with the issue that Hitler had to be in some ways played, and we didn't want to get a character to play Hitler. We just didn't want to. It was just not something that we wanted people to be able to get into the mindset. So what was developed was a game that I think Jim has now developed on and called something a bit different, but this was at the time it was called Hitler's Henchmen, and it was the senior Nazi party officials who sat around and tried to get into a central point where they would have the ear of Hitler and have their plans approved. We've also done fantastic themes. I just listed a few of them. Middle-earth style fantasy, there's a whole Yendor campaign that Jim has put together. And I have to say that Jim and Brian are very much the drivers on the fantasy line, with Pennine coming up at the end there with their own pirates, zombies, and Game of Thrones, which Becky ran for Megagame Makers and then for others, and alternative military history. And I would class alternative military history as fantastic. It requires suspension of disbelief amongst those who know things. So A Very British Civil War was about the possibility that our king in the UK did not abdicate in 1936, and the civil war that would ensue. Utterly unbelievable to a historian, but enormous fun as a mega game. And so you have to then create an alternative reality, an assumed reality. There's been a Cthulhu Gothic horror game which had multiple strands together. There was this superheroes game called City of Shadows. I really wanted to get this photo in. That's a photo of an enormously influential man called John Powney, and very unfortunate. He's died recently and had. I just wanted to take the opportunity to pay tribute to a really extraordinary gentleman. There's been a Star Trek game that was run, except that the name Star Trek, of course, means that you didn't have a Star Trek game. It was called something else. And there have been the well-known zombies games, pirates games to start very early on and repeated recently. Becky's Game of Thrones game, which was very large in scale again. So just a few things. That was the Star Trek game. Sorry, not a Star Trek game. It was called Final Frontier. And it was most definitely not a Star Trek game. The fact that those ships look remarkably like Star Trek ships is nothing whatsoever to do with it. Again, this was in early period, so there were two of those games before Springtime for Hitler and several afterwards. I think that role play is a way in which we've really developed as we've gone. I think this is open to question, and this is very much my personal view. But as somebody coming from an RPG background, I played in the Ender games, and I sort of recognised them, but they were not the role play that I was used to. They were role play that had developed into an area that I was used to, but developed from the fact that if you're playing a senior commander, you have to take on the ideas of that senior commander. To me, this very much came together in Sengoku, which is, I think, a brilliant game, one of my favourite games. It's a key game for me in development of that role play. It's about clan warfare in the Japanese shogun era, and this was an alien culture to most, so it required the stylized meetings and the style warfare and the very much the formality to get people to understand how this culture worked. And they had to get into the role play. I think one of my favourite memories of actually any time I was LU, one of the Japanese teams, and I was therefore representing all the lower samurai and also the lower farmers, etc. So when I was asked a question it was of a particular type, I stayed kneeling down until I was told to stand up and I was asked the question directly. And this, I think, brought it home to me, and it brought it home, I hope, to the team. This is we're very unfortunate in not having, but you can see the way that the stylized meetings were very, and that's somebody I don't remember, but that's a case where obviously somebody is committing seppuku because that's what they required themselves to do. That wasn't in the rules. They required themselves because they got into that role play space. Press is now seen as a megagame. As far as I know, it started at Terry Martin's Unfinished Business. I took it on and it was seen as really a way of getting information out. but there were some developments, and I'm quite pleased with the press role in Washington Conference, because it wasn't a role at the side of the game. It was very involved in the game. Each press player had individual team briefs and objectives. They played a real character of the time, and press at the time, the reason I did this was because I to reality. Press of the time was enormously influential and to some of the teams coming into Washington. So I wanted that reflected, and I thought they did a brilliant job here, and have done a brilliant job on many occasions. I think that in Watch the Skies 2, Jim toyed with the idea of competition in the press, and Jim and Becky still shudder at that. I don't think it was able to be carried through. And then Becky, of course, introduced or helped with the international press, which she developed the tools for in a hospital bed for the wide area megagame. That's to say, the distributed megagame which was Urban Nightmare. Right, I'm going to pause for questions at that stage and to take a quick swig. Do we have any questions?
We do, yes. Peter has come back with an interesting question. The Somme megagame and The Last War were incredibly ambitious, but were they successful? And would Megagame Makers ever run either games again?
Okay, I'll take Prize of Victory, and you can take Springtime for Hitler. And
Last War.
Sorry, go again.
It was the Somme and The Last War.
Oh, sorry, The Last War. My apologies. You take The Last War, and I'll take the Somme. So, Last War first.
Thank you, Dave. Well, was it successful? To quote a famous historical character, it was 80% successful. And I can't speak for Megagame Makers, but I have no plans to run Last War again. It was. Dave said that saying it can't be done is a surefire way of getting me to do it. And having done The Last War, I realised that it was a bit of an overstretch. Not in terms of designing it, setting it up, or organising it, or the players, but it was a little bit too much. If I were going to do something like that, I would approach it very differently. So Last War was, I think you might get feedback from people who were at it. It was enjoyed by quite a lot of people, possibly not by everybody, and it was good enough, but I wouldn't do it again that way myself. And I might very, very likely to do a multi-day megagame again, which is the other innovative part of Last War. It's the first time we ran a megagame over 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, and we were very unsure whether that was ever going to work. And I believe it did work better than we expected. People terribly fearful that people wouldn't come back for the second day. And so that's something that would happen again. Very likely will happen again. But the specific game, The Last War, unlikely. Dave?
Okay. Prize of Victory, originally called Muck and Bullets, developed for and then played for Megagame Makers. Did it work? Yes. I think it worked much better than I'd expected. It did what it was designed to do, which is how you test whether it worked. It did it for the school kids in that they understood what they were doing much more. They took some of the maps with them when they visited Flanders and the Somme, and they got a lot out of it. On one of them, we had them writing war reports after each turn, and they really went to town on that. They took to it better than the Megagamers did, I have to say, I think, in that we had variable length turns. We started off with half, and then just increased the tempo as the day went past, as they were more able to deal. And we ended up, I think they were about 12-minute turns. They were able to deal with it very much, very easily. So yes, in terms of would I do it again? Again, like Jim, I don't know if anybody else would wish to, and anybody that wishes to, by the way, I've got all of the components up in my loft, and you're more than welcome to borrow them at least. But also, all of the rules, etc., are available and I wouldn't wish to do that again because it's a very operational game, and that isn't where my interest is. It has to be, I think, about the most operational game we've done, for very good reasons, but about the most operational game we've done. Okay, I'd like
I've got one more question.
Okay, I
right.
think we'll be quick on that because we're slightly run out of time.
Okay, so very quickly, John from West Coast, what are your thoughts on one-off event games versus the current trend to alter one game theme over and over? Do you guys as a group have a preference, and how many playthroughs until you start finding you're tired of the setting as both designers and players?
I think you've mixed up 2 points there, John, if you don't mind me saying so. The setting and the theme can stay the same, but the game can change. The game almost always changes because we have a belief in development and improvement. So I've run that game 5 times now, I think, and each time it has developed and become better because I've learned from the previous occasion. Have I become fed up with it? Not yet, but I would want to look to game development and new ideas, and that's what would interest me as a designer, and I think interests most people in Megagame Makers. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but it's really what we like doing. We like developing games. Would you agree with that? Chris, do you think is that the way we come across?
I think so.
Is it the way we come across, Chrissy, that really central is the...
So personally, I think it comes across that you guys want to try new things a lot. So rather than run a game again and again, that you'd rather make something new.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I would just add that I think one of the issues, and it's not just an issue for Megagame Makers, is that playtesting a Megagame, unlike many games, playtesting a Megagame has its challenges because the only way you really test a Megagame is to play the Megagame.
Yeah.
So every Megagame has an element of being a live playtest as well as being trying to develop. So it's not a surprise if you see the same game being replayed with developments and tweaks and so on, because actually we don't get to see what the game is really like until we do the whole thing. We test as many components as we can, sub-games and elements. So I think that's of the nature, to some extent, I think it's of the nature of Megagames anyway. But I'm constantly being reined in my ambitions to come up with new games. And my folder containing game designs that I'm never ever going to be allowed to do is gigantic. But there you go. Okay.
I'm going to move on pretty quick. So the next 2 batches I'm going to do together because time is running out. So forgive me if I'm a bit faster. I'm not sure what happens if we overrun. I'd quite like to see something myself after this, so I'm going to get on reasonably quickly, and we'll take questions at the end of what I'm saying. Okay, let's have a look at how we operate. Well, first of all, who are we? There are 16 of us, okay? And you have to be a Megagame maker, you have to have either run a game during the last 5 years, or have a game that you've got planned and having had run a game at some stage, or do something that contributes to the group. Now, Ollie and Chrissy
would go to the third.
Ollie and Chrissy are the admin officers now, and they are developing their first games, but they're very much a part of the team and leading us as first amongst equals. What I've done is put numbers there that show the activity. So they show the number of occasions that somebody has run. So you can see that Jim is mad because he's run them 82 times. Brian is almost as mad, half as mad, because he's run them 35 times. Bernie is half as mad again because he's run them 16 times. And then Rob, Terry and I are back on the 7s and 8s. That obviously doesn't reflect activity. There are a lot of people all of us get very involved in everything. We support each other throughout, particularly for development and for production. The way I see what we do, we are trying to model reality. Every game has to extract from reality a model that is going to be used for the game to be developed. So we're extracting a model, we're identifying the important parts of reality. When I say reality, I include assumed reality, but for me, a game has to have the depth of a properly assumed reality to be any good. And so you have to have a model that shows that you choose. It's very much a choice about which parts of reality you're going to play. From that, you develop the rules, which are the way that the player experience interworks with the model and with reality. So rules, mechanisms, all of that I put under the heading of rules. And the beauty of Megagames is that we've introduced the idea of control cutting into all of this. So control brings reality into the player experience, even if the rules and the model haven't explicitly taken account of it. Those of us who were brought up on Wargames, board games, and things like paragraph 2.8.7.4, subsection 3b, except on some occasions, but really this is a breath of fresh air, because it allows you to concentrate on important things and to put the player at the center of what you're trying to do. We're very much, to me, again, there's very much a reality against fantastical sort of area. And there's also a simulation against playability, and separate them out. Simulation, sometimes you can look for the eventual little bit where you haven't quite simulated something, and that is at odds with playability. So where we sit is firmly in the middle towards the left, bottom corner. We're trying to model reality, and we're trying to do it in a playable way. Now, these aren't exclusive. We are thing, but it's the degree to which that is important to you. There is no point in a wonderful simulation that is entirely unplayable. To me, fantastical means that you don't have the depth of understanding from just your sense of the setting that reality gives you. So if I am playing in a fantasy or a science fiction game, I want a depth of briefing to be there. Otherwise, I personally don't enjoy it. I am very much on my own there, and I know others do. What we've learnt is keep them busy. Now, there are obvious limits to this. What I've done is I've taken all of the games that we got feedback scores, and I've plotted the enjoyment score against the rate of play score. This is on a 1 to 5 scale. So what you see is that there is a strong correlation between enjoyment and rate of play. Now, this is not a predictive model. This model will break down as soon as you go much beyond the centre area there. But it does represent a reality that I think we observe anyway, that if people come out of a mega game exhausted, and if you say to them, were you too busy? They say, well, yeah, but I did enjoy it. And so you have to make sure that everybody has something to do all the time. And that means some people will have a bit too much to do. That is preferable to anybody not having enough to do. Victory points are an anathema to me. And I took a quote from Board Game Geek. They want to define what a board game is. So they say any game that cannot be won or lost is considered an activity and is out of scope. In other words, it is not, by their definition, a board game. Fair enough. So we can't really advertise in Board Game Geek because we don't run board games. We don't run games, I think, according to them. But we have this idea that zero-sum games where somebody is playing transactionally, where they are seeing a gain that they make as a loss that somebody else makes, that is quite naive and uninteresting. So we have no tolerance for that. We don't think that life or games are interesting if they're zero-sum, as zero-sum. I do think a few of our politicians, particularly in the United States, would do well to play a few mega games. Feedback, always get it. Make sure you get it. It informs what you do. You have to get it at the game, in our view. You have to get it at the game, in our view, because if you don't, the opportunity is lost. We look at feedback very carefully. We discuss it in a lot of detail. We look at what went wrong and what went right. It's not the only thing we look at. We particularly look at feedback which was written, but often people will come up and talk to us. Often you will get situations where change their mind. I certainly have been in a situation where I've known that somebody has marked a sheet one way and then has spoken to me about it in a very different way later. So you have to judge these things properly, and some people just have a bad day and you have to take account of that, and some people just have a good day because they're feeling great that day. Either way, it's an opportunity to improve, and it really is an opportunity to improve. I would say there's almost as much agonizing over the feedback as there is involvement of game control on the day. I know most designers will look at the feedback on a 1 to 5 scale and say, oh, that's a 1. Let's make sure we understand what the problem was, because there was clearly a problem. It might be a problem of conflict of personalities sometimes, or it might be something to do with the game design. But anyway, we will find that that is something that we take very seriously. Success factors in mega games are, to me, you've got to have a good design, you've got to have good control, and they're the things that are in our direct control. But you've also got to have good players, and you've got to have a good vibe about the whole thing. If you get all of that right, then you have a good player experience, and the good player experience is what we're interested in. So a good player experience leads to loyalty amongst your players. Any marketeer will tell you, or any marketeer of a service will tell you that loyalty is much more important than expansion of the numbers, because it costs a lot in Megagames to get more players than it does to keep loyal ones, in crude terms. But overall, anyway, we're in it as a hobby. We want a good player experience, and that happens to mean that your players will stay loyal and you get more players who will then become loyal. And we've noticed that happening. So good design, listen to the feedback and work as a team. Good players, you need players that are matched to the role. So casting is incredibly important, and it's been a difficulty that we have not known people, and that we've relied on what they say about themselves. Now, I know there are some other things that might be done there, but we do provide all the players with a note field when they book for them to say what they wish, and for notes on their profile, so to say in general what they wish, and that's held on their on the database. You need clear promotional material. You need clarity, because often a bad player experience comes not from bad design or anything else, but from the fact that the player coming there hasn't got what they expected to get. So you need good control. You need a way of developing the players. Chestnut Lodge is such a way. And you need a good vibe. So the admin needs to be smooth, the venue needs to be smooth, and you need to be... Fortunately, Megagame Makers has no problem with that. I think that it is the definition of a friendly group. And you need to look after the players. And I think the recent moves to do that have been very worthwhile. Okay, let's have a look at Watch the Skies 2004. And I'm aware that we're running out of time, but we've got 5 more minutes, so I'll be able to tackle this. I'm then going to stay around for a little bit. Shut Up and Sit Down did a terrific job, and all of the forums and all of there were 60 players involved. It was a popular theme, and apart from some casualties in Moscow, aliens were entirely peaceful, but that really was a bit of a problem. Costumes, well, obviously everybody has costumes, and that food bribes were a thing, and that Shut Up and Sit Down, in fact, thought they were poison. Psyops, if that's the way you spell it, were a crucial factor. Sorry, everything about that is wrong. The actual facts are that there were 38 players. We had real difficulty recruiting people, or 4 people from Shut Up and Sit Down sign up, because that 38 players included quite a few control players. The aliens were entirely peaceful. I was in charge of Russia and I lied. Jerry Ellsworth was, I think he was celebrating something, and he celebrated by providing lab coats for everybody and shirts for the USA. John was trying to get rid of some really horrible, stinking camels, so the rest of us refused, whereas Shut Up and Sit Down took it and then thought it was poison. I understand why. There were no psyops. That was totally in the imagination, the power of Megagames. So this gives you an idea of what was happening before 2000. In 2014, we were bobbing around just under the 200 players a year mark, which is still not bad. And actually, this doesn't reflect what I remember at the time, which was the last was starting to increase. And had we run a Napoleonic or an operational game, I think we would have had higher numbers on the previous game. But as it was, I think it had 50. But then 2014 happened, Shut Up and Down, things went absolutely haywire. The number of games went haywire as well. In the early days, there was one year where 12 games were run, 1 a month. And that wasn't achieved, but the number of games went up dramatically. So we've kept up the momentum since 2014. We continue experimentation. There was the 300 plus player games that Jim ran. We've extended the player basics dramatically, but we have kept a lot of them, and we kept the previous ones loyal. There have been more women involved, not enough, but there have been more women involved. We've seen history games being enjoyed by many more, and there are still too few of them around in my, but because we don't repeat games that much, we have a lot of history games under our belt. The admin is a lot smoother now. I've worked on the new website. I've implemented the booking system there. So we have a pretty cheap and I think smooth working admin system. And we've helped people wherever we can because that's what we like doing. But we've got a lot of challenges to come. Now, we have to get to a position where we're more representative. We're in on the planet, and so it should be possible that we involve more women, more Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. We need to stay, in my view, and this is very much more, as evangelists for. We need to deal with the online situation. We haven't planned online because I think one or two of us want to do them but are wary of the quality. And continue to disprove this fallacy that started to rise at one, that a hobby approach is inevitably lower quality. We don't think it is. We want to involve and develop more designers. We've had a couple of times asked them to come in, develop a game, and we've worked with them. And we need to develop more control. We ask people if they'd like to come into control, identify that they might be suitable and might be people that would want to do that. Absolutely critical role and a pinch point. And we need to keep the players that we have. And most of the challenges that we have, I cannot yet imagine. Right, apart from that, let me show you what we've got planned already for 2021. Starting to run games, we believe, from May, but we've planned May, October, November, December. So, Chrissy, would you like to just very, very briefly go through those? And this is the last slide I have, and I've just run out of time. So my apologies, but I will take more questions after this and stay around in this channel.
Great.
Right,
Yeah. So we have got the Lace Wars on the 22nd of May by Bernie and Gareth. It's the 7 Years' War. All the soldiers wore very silly lace. We've got the Bear Growls by Terry on the 25th of September. Near Future and a Baltic Crisis. We've got The Boys Are Back in Town by Pickles on the 16th of October about superheroes. We've got Washington Conference with Dave on the 6th of November, and that's the Centennial, if that's the right word. And then we've got The Bastard Comes by Andrew.
Right, well, there you go.
Which is about the Normans and their allies. Right, can you hear me?
Okay, so I have not kept up with developments. There are two more than I thought. That sounds great. Okay, thank you all very much for listening to me and indulging me.